Welcome to this episode of the Essential Church Podcast, an ongoing conversation about some of the most important issues facing the local church today. I'm your host, Andrew Arndt, and today I want to take you to a conversation I had recently with Glenn Packiam and Dr. Michelle Anthony. Michelle leads our family ministries here at New Life North and is an incredible leader and thinker. And a question that I get asked often is, Andrew, tell me about your study habits. Like, what does it look like for you to stay a lifelong learner in ministry? What do you read? Why do you read it? And all those things. I thought that would be a really fun podcast to have. So I sat down with Glenn and Michelle to talk with them about how this value kind of sits for them and how they give it flesh and bone in the midst of the hustle and the bustle of ministry. We had a super fun conversation. I think you're going to be helped by it. Without further commentary from me, here's the interview. All right. Well, I'm with my two colleagues here, Dr. Glenn Packiam and Dr. Michelle Anthony. In the presence of greatness here, I appreciate you two so much. Here's the conversation I want to have today. One of the questions that I get asked often is about my reading and my study habits. We have a lot on our plates as pastors and ministry leaders, a lot of the demand of ministry, but I think that this vocation requires that we stay sharp mentally, that we stay at the edge of who we are. And you both model this so well, this value of lifelong learning, continuing to keep the sword sharp. And so I want to talk about that, study habits, learning habits a little bit. And before we jump all the way into just kind of what it looks like for you guys, I would love to hear maybe where it started for you, how the value developed kind of in your own vocational story and why it's so important for you.
Yeah, I think I was really fortunate to have lifelong learners around me. My dad was a biochemist and also elder at our church, and he just was voracious for learning. And my mom is a question asker, and a lot of my mentors were just curious people. And I remember loving that learning process. In fact, I can remember my parents were in a meeting that we were calling a new pastor to our church, and my mom and dad were in there and all the elders and their wives and everything. And then all the kids were playing in the other room. And I was only 13 years old, but I wanted to be in the room with all the adults. And so I think some of it's a personality or something that God put in me, but I love curious people and I love people who are new. And then I think being in education, I remember being at the university level, and I remember teachers who I was drawn to because they were learning, and it was like a book I read last week or illustration. And then there were the ones who pulled out their notebooks and, blew out of the dust. And you could tell
hadn't been opened in a while.
Yeah, you could tell it was the notes from a long time ago, and it felt different. And I remember thinking to myself, I want to be the leader who's always learning, and asking questions and being curious.
So good. Glenn, what about for you, man?
It's amazing, Michelle. And I love you talking about your family because this is maybe an Asian family joke or stereotype, but I thought, our homes are always known for parents making their kids do extra homework. So when I was a kid, I'd come home from school, and if I was bored, my mom would say, why don't you grab one of those encyclopedias and look up a bird or an animal or whatever, and then write me a one-page paper and draw a picture or whatever. I had no idea, but I was learning how to read and research and write,
Back in the day when you had the Encyclopedia Britannica in the living room.
No Wikipedia stuff, no cheating with that.
Yeah, but you were learning to research.
Exactly. So I do think it's true. The home life sort of has shaped me. I think at some point in ministry, I realized, Andrew, that my output is going to be of a lesser quality than my input. And that can sound like it's bad news. It is kind of bad news, at first. If you take one of your heroes, if you love Tim Keller, and you're like, I want to preach like Tim Keller, guess what? You can't just listen to Tim Keller. You got to listen to who Tim Keller is listening to.
Right, exactly.
So early on for me, I was reading C.S. Lewis, and I loved it. But it wasn't until my seminary years that I realized, Lewis is pulling from Augustine and Aquinas. Now, I'm not like you, Andrew. You just read the Summa Theologica like just for a morning.
For breakfast.
I'm not like that. But I have attempted to try to challenge myself a bit, to read at a harder level.
I think that's right.
Because your output's always going to be lower than your input.
Somebody just said that to me recently. They said, Andrew, the books that we see you posting on social media, those are hard books, and they really feel like they're above our head. And I just said, this just happened this morning, and I said, I only read books that are way above my level. And that's the only way that you grow. It forces you to rise up. It forces your mind to shift into new space.
It's like lifting a little bit more weight every time, right?
Exactly.
Which clearly I do.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking about this question, the biography question is an important one. I love the story about your parents. That's really cool. I was thinking like where it ignited for me was watching the senior pastor of our church when I was a kid, watching him preach. It was so clear that he was thinking hard and drinking from wells outside of the wells that I grew up in. And I just love that. It makes me think about that great West Wing episode where Sam Seaborn is talking about what he's looking for in a presidential candidate. And he says, I want to know there's a mind at work. Like I want an active mind.
Let's sing it. That's where Lin-Manuel looking for a mind.
But that's what it was. I saw a pastor whose mind was working, and that ignited it for me. I thought, whatever we do in pastoral ministry, we have to live at the cutting edge of our own imagination about what church and kingdom are. Yeah. And then what you're doing in the church is you're trying to organize things in that direction. So for me, it ignited there, and it's lasted all the way through these years. I'm grateful to say.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So talk to us, guys, about what your own study habits look like. You both oversee an enormous amount of ministry here at the church. Michelle, I failed to mention, directs our family ministries here at New Life North. So she's got a huge amount on her plate. Glenn, associate senior pastor, one of our staff elders as well. So you both oversee a ton, and there's outside things that you're doing too. And yet you're living at the edge of your own thinking and your imagination. Talk to us about how do you make that work? What does ongoing learning and study look like for you?
Yeah. Well, it's changed. I have adult children now. So when my children were little, it was late at night. It was burning the midnight lamp. Yeah. And it was finding those little spaces, waiting in carpool. And I do think you have to choose it. You have to choose it over something else. And and then when I was traveling, I would see people going into the books, the little shops there at the airports and picking up People magazine and, all those things. And you have to choose because sometimes you just want your brain to go off. But I would choose to pick something that was going to edify me or study or something that I needed to work on. And so I think it's like food choices too. We have to choose what we consume in our mind. And then, I think it right now for me, it's sometimes in the mornings before I even come into work. That is my best space. The nighttime it was harder, but that was the space I had. But studying is in the morning for me. And then I find that when it's in the morning and it's in me, whether it's God's word or a book or something that I'm nibbling on, without a doubt, you use it that day.
There's no doubt.
It's just weird how that
shows up.
Well,
it shows up.
It's like so much compost put in the soil of your mind almost,
Right.
I do have people ask me sometimes, well, like, how do you remember all this stuff? And I don't make these days anyway, maybe you guys are different on this. I don't put any pressure on myself anymore to try to remember all the things that I read. That's not the point for me.
Right.
Part of it is just the exercise of stretching your mind, and then also the investment in the soil of your mind. You just know that as those ideas are filtering down, they're going to pop up, and they do. It shows up in a sermon or in something that you're writing or in a coaching moment. All of a sudden you go, there was this thing I read this morning that really helped.
Well, yeah. And when people say, gosh, you're so smart, I'm like, well, I just read it this morning. Like, I'm not really remembering it.
But I do love that because sometimes people will say, okay, you referenced, 3 different things or whatever. And it's like, yeah, but that wasn't stuff so on the flip side, it's not the stuff I read most recently, but it's just somewhere in the backdrop. It's in the soil. I love that metaphor.
Yeah.
And it shows up. So I remember early on in ministry, I was in the worship leading kind of role here at New Life, and we would travel sometimes and do some band trips. And I was tired, but a lot of times on the flights home, I'd be pulling out a book and reading. So I do think it is about redeeming the time. It is about finding those moments and those spaces without you don't want to push yourself too hard. The brain is like a muscle, I think, and you can fatigue it. On the other hand, we don't stretch ourselves enough, and we often sort of veg out and like, hey, that's a moment you could have read for something. What has helped me is to have time goals as opposed to book count goals. Andrew's
really
ridiculous. I mean, if you follow Andrew, you know he reads like 67 books a year or something. but and hard books, right? I barely will move more than 20 or read more than 20 in a year. But what I'm trying to do is, can I sit down for 30 minutes 5 days a week?
Yes.
Maybe not every day, but maybe 4 or 5 days a week. Can I at least devote 30 minutes where I'm sitting down and reading, and you just kind of move the needle, and you got to trust the cumulative effect of study.
Yeah. Do you know, I think it's interesting for, younger leaders. I like them to stretch. You know, I when I was a professor at a Christian university, I gave them The Divine Conspiracy by Dallas Willard. They were like, it's so hard. We can't do it. But the brain is that muscle.
Yes.
And I think here we're doing a podcast, but with the amount of podcasts and amount of books on tape and just opportunities people have younger to not engage in studying, I'm grateful because that muscle was cultivated early in my life. But I really still encourage people at a young age to do this because you know, as you get older, it's harder to memorize or to retain some of that stuff. And when you're talking about that deep well, there are things that I know really, really well, but it literally is from 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
And it got down deep.
Never forgot it.
And so
It became part of your framework.
Yeah. So if there's young listeners out there, like, it's good to do that hard work when you're young and those habits are created in your life. It pays dividends your whole life.
Yes.
You know, we both have our doctorates, and people go like, oh, you're so smart. I'm like, I'm actually really not that smart. It's a lot about perseverance. Perseverance.
Misha, I love this. Like, so can I just reference something real quick?
Please.
I just finished listening to an audiobook, and that's another way to kind of work. Books that don't require me underlining, and maybe at some point we can talk about your note-taking systems and all of that sort of stuff. But there's some books where I just listen on audio, and I just finished listening to Grit on audiobook. And she opens by saying her dad growing up would say, you're no genius, you know, and again, Asian family. And she said, but what he meant was, it doesn't come easy to you.
Right.
And she said, that's not even what genius is. Genius is, and she, of course, then went on to study grit, where grit is passion times perseverance, or passion plus perseverance, and so for so many of us, it's not that we're brilliant or we're smart. We're not. But you take a little bit of talent times effort, and then you gain the skill.
Netflix benching.
Minus Netflix, and then you take that talent or that skill that you've acquired, and then put in more effort and look at the achievement.
It is a
that
cumulative
comes.
effect. You're building up a muscle that'll allow you to engage with different kinds of material down the road. I was not planning on asking this question, but I do want to get your perspective on it. So many young leaders that I run into, the podcast is the thing. I got 8 podcasts I listen to, and these are amazing. And they're reading fewer and fewer books. And I get it. Like, I think podcasts are great. We're doing a podcast.
Exactly.
The great irony.
Exactly.
I don't really listen to any podcasts. But anyway, be that as it may. What's the difference between listening to a podcast and reading a book?
Well, yeah. I mean, a podcast is primarily passive, right? I'm listening, and if there's a thought, then I can go down that trail, or I can Google it, or I can read about it further, and it's stimulating. I think it's better than nothing, for filling our mind. But the activity of studying requires so much more of me. It requires more, and I think then the output is greater because of that. It requires me to think at a different level. It requires me, I can go at my own pace. A podcast might move on from a thought. And I'm still nourishing, so I'm kind of getting a landscape rather than a deep well. When I'm studying, I'll stop and I'll really, go like gnaw on that for a while. There's a meditation piece to that you miss in a podcast.
I agree. And see how that idea spiders out a little bit. It actually gets to the note-taking habits a little bit. I think you hit the nail right on the head. That the podcast is passive, whereas the reading is an active habit. And so when I think about the books that I read and the way that I engage them, underlining for sure, dog-earing,
I've seen your books.
Notes. Yeah, my books actually are like journals is what they are. It's an experience all the way through it, writing notes in the margins. And I think about all the times where that's happened with me, where I underline something, and that's a thought that I just have to sit with, because now it's starting to challenge ways of thinking, and I'm going at my own pace with it. And there are times that I'll get up from that and I'll write that little statement on the whiteboard and just stand back and look at it. And all of a sudden, 6 other associations come to me. Bing, 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 bing. And now the knowledge is starting to spider out in a way that it wouldn't have if I was just passively kind of receiving the podcast.
Well, right. And it's primarily passive, right? It's not exclusively passive, but I think that it's informative.
Yeah.
So you talk to people who listen to a lot of podcasts, they're interesting, they're informed on a lot of issues, it makes for great conversation, especially in this day and age. So I think it makes somebody informed, but it doesn't really make somebody educated, right? And there's a difference.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. I think I agree with all that, but just for the sake of pushing this out, I do think there's something about auditory learning, and certainly some people do learn better by listening. I also think it's the oral tradition is sort of the earliest human way of learning. So there's something human about talk while you walk. Well, the podcast host is talking while you walk. So there's something there. It's hard to read a book while you're walking, but you can listen.
Well, there's certain things you can learn informative.
Yeah.
There's certain things you have to learn by,
and
doing.
I don't know that this is fully true, but I wonder if a podcast is necessary because the best podcasts are giving you a synthesis and a summary. And therefore, they're a lot like reading secondary literature.
Sure.
So secondary, well, or even like okay, let's say you're like secondary literature. Like, what is that? Okay, so let's say you're like, I don't know, Luther's theology of justification or whatever. Well,
so you read a book on it.
You could read Luther, or you could read someone who's summarizing that. That's okay. Those are gateway sort of things. And we can't possibly read all the books in the world, right? So podcasts can be great sources for synthesis and summaries. But I do agree there's sometimes, and I probably will have half a dozen of these books a year where I know this one's an important one. Yeah. This is the one I'm going to take my time with. This is the one I'm going to actually take notes in Evernote to replicate an outline of the argument in each chapter, and then I make myself do the discipline of write a summary. Like, what is the one paragraph? So if I were writing the abstract for this book and its argument, what is it? Someone asked me. And pastors, you might say, well, when do you ever use that? Literally, I had coffee a week ago with a young man in our congregation. And he said, I'm thinking about reading this book. And it was The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, about how we got to the autonomous sexual self, Carl Trueman's book. And I had mapped it, I'd outlined it. And I said, oh, well, here's my 6-point summary of the book. And he's like, oh, well, there you go. Right. So you do this work because people count on us to synthesize for them.
No, it's true. And I'm certainly not dogging podcasts.
No, I know.
I feel like what we need is a robust, balanced diet of information assimilation, right? So this might be treading too personal, but like the same thing is true when we just go to church and we listen to our pastor. The pastor has synthesized all of their study into this quippy little message, right? And they can say, here the Greek word teleos means, but when you actually have to go and you use the tools to figure out that and you do the study, there's such a
actually learn more.
Yeah, there's more there. There's a depth, and you have ownership of it that you can actually share. So the same would be true to anything that is simply auditory, and we're not doing the hard work of
and it's
studying.
It's not that the auditory is the problem. It's that a part of what the podcast also takes away, just thinking also about like ancient styles of learning. You talked about that. The Socratic Method, right?
Right.
Is that we're engaging with an actual human being in talking about these things. So an idea gets laid out. We've got a chance to ask some questions, clarifying questions. So now there's this syncing up of minds that allows the knowledge to take root. So again, like not to dog on the podcast, but if that's your only way, if that's your only way of learning,
but
I think
this will be the last episode we ever do.
But the same is true for
the curtain falls.
The same is true for somebody who is only in their office reading books and never interacting with others and never listening to anything else. It's anything that we get isolated in. I think that's the danger in learning is we all have a preferred method. And we can just go down that method and not engage in the others, which make us the whole learner.
Michelle, that really makes me think of a dimension of a pastor's study habits that maybe we haven't quite named, and that is with others. I remember 2011 or whatever, one of the N.T. Wright's sort of paradigm shifting books had come out. And I was like, should I read this? Like, what if it's wrong? And what, so I grabbed Daniel, I grabbed a couple of other pastors, like, guys, do you want to read? And I almost felt like, because someone had written like an attack book on this book,
Right,
and it was his justification book. And I thought, let me read this with some others so that I can be safeguarded against this. So isn't part of it reading with others?
Well,
Definitely reading with others.
I mean,
for
there was a thought process that we would go to, back in the early 90s, that all higher education would just eventually be online. And while online schooling has taken off and given opportunity to people in places that we wouldn't have access, I just don't think that it'll ever go away completely because of that component of
the need to digest with other people.
The need to digest.
That's what I loved about seminary, was exiting a class and sitting down with your friends in the cafe and going, what did you think about that idea? We need that. We carry it together in community. Okay, we need to wrap up in a few minutes here. I'm curious about, because I get this question a lot too, why do you read what you read? And how do you choose that? The books that you're reading and the things that you're engaging with. Do you guys have a strategy or a method for how you engage that? Or do you kind of let it flow? And what is it that you're reading? What regularly winds up on your plate?
Yeah.
I do have a bit of a method. So one part of the method is I need a bit of a variety. Michelle, you said a balanced diet sort of thing. So if I am reading something, I try to read something that's a bit more technical or academic to just keep that muscle sharp since finishing Hard Knock. I want to keep that muscle strong. So something a bit stretching. I do want to read something that is more on the leadership side. So even a book like Grit, it's like, okay, that's just, it's research, but it's light for leadership. And then Andrew, you do a better job of this than I do, but it's also good for me to read something narrative. So for me, that's going to be a memoir or a narrative history. But I will say, this might sound weird, but I actually do kind of pray about this. So like just the other day, there were like 3 books that I was like, which one should I dive into next? And I brought all 3 home, and I'm looking at it. I read a couple pages of each, and it was like, Lord, what's the book I need in this season?
Yeah.
That's really
and then
good.
I'll pull one. So these are hunches and nudges, but I think it's important to invite the Holy Spirit in it.
It's really good.
That's really good, Glenn. For me, I'm pretty intentional about that because for me, when you are in school and you're studying and reading a lot of books, it's kind of given to you. But now that I'm picking them for myself, so I have buckets. I have buckets for my own personal spiritual development. I have books on my area of ministry. So I've been in ministry for 35 years, kids ministry, youth ministry, parenting. Those are organic fields, like there's some theological tenets, but there's organic fields of expression. So I try to stay relevant in that. I try to read at least one book a year that is by someone I completely disagree with. Not weird. I know.
Awesome. Yeah.
But somebody, and then I find like, we actually have some common ground or something, or somebody I think might think differently than me, or something that popular culture is listening to. Like I have a book right now where I go through it. It's by Oprah Winfrey, because I think but I read her, she doesn't fuel me, but I know she fuels so many people, and
to know that cultural conversation.
Like the cultural conversation. What are other people reading that's shaping their theology that is wrong? And what's so sexy and attractive about that they're latching onto it?
How can I speak the gospel meaningfully to culture if I have no idea where the culture is at?
So I try to do something that's really offensive, I guess, to me. But my soul isn't being fed. I don't know. There's that piece of it. And then, I love leadership books. I'm actually reading one right now that's challenging the right questions. It's better questions, less regret.
So good.
And but Andy Stanley, he there's these 5 basic questions. The question of why we're doing something and really being honest. The question of what story am I writing? How, that kind of goes to legacy and our part. And then asking the question of the paying attention to the tension. So, we have that gut check, but we kind of ignore it. Yeah. And then what's wise, and then what will require me to be loving. And I'm like, okay, boom, like even just those, I can use that in almost every aspect, my marriage, with my team. So I try to look for books that will have more impact than just a single relationship.
So good. Same for me on all of those. I love those. The 2 that I would add, that have come up in the last 10 years or so that I wouldn't have guessed would have been important for me when I was in seminary. Poetry all of a sudden has become really important for me in the last 5 years, especially I think as a preacher and as a writer. Developing a better ear for a turn of phrase and the power of economy and language, to help communicate truth. So I've loved reading the poets. Mary Oliver is on the regular for me, and Wendell Berry, and some of the classics like Gerard Manley Hopkins have been important. And then also, I had the most difficult time when I was a kid. I could not finish like stories. Fiction I just couldn't do it. And I don't know what changed for me. I think it was actually falling in love with the Bible.
Yeah.
In seminary, the Bible as a compelling story started to give me an ear for story, and that began to grow in me over the last bunch of years. So novels and memoirs are also on the regular for me. The power of a story and developing an eye and an ear for a good story. It sends me back into the biblical text with fresh eyes to see things from a different point of view.
Yes.
And also to notice so much of the power of preaching happens when we're noticing that little tiny detail in the story that would be easy to blow by.
Yes.
But it's actually the pivotal detail of the whole thing. Yes. And so I've just learned that, like, for me anyway, as a preacher, the last 5 to 8 minutes of a message where it really comes home, it almost always hangs on the detail. Yeah. That little detail, and it's the novels or the memoirs that they're just sharpening my eyes for those kinds of things.
I know you're going to wrap right here, Andrew, but I just want to point out an obvious thing that all three of us have said is we're not talking about studying for preaching. Mm-hmm. This isn't the reading. It may show up in a sermon, but this is studying for your soul, for your formation,
to become a better human being, for sure. Okay, 30 seconds or less from each of you. What do you say to the person who wants to begin to take some baby steps into really making this value more central?
I think anything worth doing requires an intentionality. So I think take an afternoon, take a day, prayer, in concert with the Holy Spirit. Say, I want to be a holistic learner, and I want to be a lifelong learner. Just determine today, I'm going to be a lifelong learner to the day I die, and I'm going to be learning and growing, and make a plan, and it will probably morph over time. My plans have morphed. So it's not so much about sticking to a plan in a rigorous way, but it's having a plan and then making it broad enough and having enough, find out what your go-to place is, and then add some other things that are a little uncomfortable.
So good.
And start small.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you are reading an author that you've always wanted to read, so say C.S. Lewis, don't start with Mere Christianity. I know it's the best one, but it's also pretty hard. Maybe you start with Screwtape Letters. Yeah. Maybe you start with The Great Divorce. So be kind to yourself and be patient. Do this as a long haul kind of thing.